All right, so I just listened to Javier Milei's big speech at Davos today, which some people were worried about because they said, "Oh my God, look, he's selling out. He's going to Davos." But there was a clip going around of I think it was when he was getting on his plane, because of course since it is Milei, he flew commercial from Argentina to Davos, and there were lots of fans on the flight. I mean, that's just such great PR to be a politician. You're flying commercial like that, and you're high profile, and everyone recognizes you, and then everyone else in Davos literally flying in on their private jets, one at a time. The U.S. represented by Antony Blinken taking his 737, one of the 737s that has not fallen out of the sky yet, to Davos, and then taking a helicopter to the actual facility. But remember, it's you and your gasoline car and your gasoline-powered lawnmower and your gasoline-powered generator that you have to use when the power grid goes out because we're run by incompetent fools. That's a big problem. All those things, all those emissions, from your lawnmower, that's a big problem. But Antony Blinken's helicopter and his 737 and all of the other Davos elites, none of that matters. And so Milei got up on stage, and Klaus Schwab was very cordial. Actually, I think he even used the word cordial in his introduction of Milei. And he said, we were all very excited to hear from him. And you know what? Before I get to Milei's speech, listening to Schwab introduce him, you could kind of tell that Schwab was saying, hey, maybe he's not one of us, but you know what? He was trying to say nice things about Milei. He's saying, well, you've reinvigorated a spirit for market capitalism in Argentina. It's like, okay, well, that's true. But for a fact that what Milei's been promoting, like the writings of Murray Rothbard, that's not Klaus Schwab's brand of capitalism. And so it was a little interesting to me. It's not the normal intolerance that I've come to expect from the establishment. Klaus Schwab didn't get up there and feel compelled to say, hey, we've invited Milei because he's the new president of Argentina, but I just want to get out of the way that he's a bigot and a sexist and a transphobe, and I condemn him, but we're going to let him speak anyway. No, he actually tried to say something like nice and adult. So not saying much when my concession, when I'm trying to say something nice about Klaus Schwab, is that, he, and the World Economic Forum, is that he acted like an adult and conducted himself, with a bit of dignity. But we hadn't heard Milei's speech yet. Maybe Klaus Schwab was only being nice because Milei was going to get up there and fillet all the Davos elites and expose himself as a poser. And now that he's been elected president of Argentina, he's going to back down from all of his commitments, and he's just going to become a standard establishment shill. After all, a lot of people were very worried that Milei coming in was very pro-Zelensky in Ukraine. He gets along well with Zelensky, and he in fact seated Viktor Orban in a corner right next to Zelensky at his at his inauguration as president of Argentina. And so it's a very sort of establishment-y thing to do. However, at the time, I defended Milei and gave him the benefit of the doubt. I didn't say that what he did was good, but I gave him the benefit of the doubt in that, every country is entitled to have their own foreign policy. In America, it very much makes sense for us to not be super pro-Ukraine. But in Argentina, that's not necessarily the smartest decision for their country, because they might benefit more by ingratiating themselves amongst Ukraine's allies, such as the United States and the European Union, two entities that Argentina, as a smaller, poorer nation, would want to stay on the good side of. Whereas in America, being pro-Ukraine means that we are sending them billions and billions and hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars. And that all that money is getting funneled, or a lot of it is, it's all getting stolen one way or another. A lot of it getting funneled through American defense contractors. There's tons of reasons to be anti-Ukraine as an American citizen that would not necessarily apply to an Argentine. And so for all that, I was willing to go into Milei's speech with an open mind. And I have to say, I was both. It was impressive, and at the same time, could have been better. But fundamentally, he said the right sorts of things. He definitely took the right tact. He took the right attitude. He did not capitulate one bit. He went up there and he was himself, and he represented the views that he espoused on the campaign trail. He essentially structured his speech as a warning to the rest of the West, coming from Argentina, a country that has been, dabbling in, a heavily state-controlled economy for 80 years. And he was saying this has not worked in our case. It has, turned us from the richest country in the Western Hemisphere to, relatively speaking, or not in absolute terms, a poor nation with lots of problems of inflation over the decades, and a couple of different eras of a couple of reigns of terror, basically, under tyrannical regimes, all in the name of the government trying to look out for people and correct for the problems of capitalism and all these things, and trying to help the poor and the impoverished. And the effect that they had was to make everyone poor. That was the thesis of Milei's speech, and honestly, I felt like this could have been a 2-hour talk that he was giving, that he was desperately trying to condense down to 30 minutes, because the video is just under 30 minutes. And then Klaus Schwab does his intro, and so really Milei gets to speak for 24 minutes, and he probably went over time. They probably told him to speak for 20 minutes. And so he's moving very fast, and I'm listening through a translator, because that's how Davos works. It's like the UN, they have live translators, and so the delivery is a little off. But Milei talks about how per capita GDP was pretty much flat from the year 0 to the year 1800, meaning that there was really no advances in productivity made by human civilization until the 19th century, thereabouts. And that's when productivity in the West, and then slowly across the rest of the world, began to shoot through the roof and grow exponentially. And that's when wealth was created for the first time. That's when you had people in this world, common people, who were able to live, whose living conditions were better than their parents' or their grandparents' generations. That's when life started to improve on this planet. And all those great advancements, he argued, were made by private enterprise. The state wasn't able to create any of that in, 2,000 years. But all of a sudden, he says, as private enterprise is creating all this wealth and exponentially increasing living standards across the Western world, then all of a sudden, states in the West, as well as in the East, as happened in China and Russia, the state decided to come in and feel the need to fix what was supposedly wrong with market capitalism. And then he gets into the real meat of it, and because, nobody there, as he acknowledged, nobody there is going to, really think of themselves as a Marxist, or a Soviet socialist, in the real economic sense. few people at the World Economic Forum are calling for literal state ownership of the means of production. And what he argued was that it's a very stiff and not very useful definition, because that essentially is a very narrow concept, state ownership of the means of production, that is not promoted by anyone today and is not relevant. It's not a relevant idea. But what is very common, very relevant, often advocated for by every elite on this planet is state micromanagement of the means of production, while allowing the means of production to remain in nominally private hands. And that in practice, there is very little difference in the end result when you have state ownership of the means of production versus just state control of the means of production. And so that is what we in English would call corporatism. I don't think that Milei used that word, but I don't know if the term corporatism exists in Spanish. I would think it would, though, because I think corporatism was originally Italian, because it should come from Italy. And of course, I think the textbook corporatist state is probably Portugal, under Salazar, of course. That's sort of that's a pretty neutral example that you can give, although even Salazar, it's a gray area, because, excuse me, I just kicked the fry pot. I always pace back and forth while I talk. That's why I can't, sit at a desk and record in front of a webcam like I'm Tim Pool or something. I can't think while I'm sitting still. I have to keep moving to keep the creative juices flowing. So anyway, moving on. Now that Milei has established essentially that, and he's doing this all very quickly, so it's kind of sloppy. He doesn't have enough time to really make any arguments, so you kind of have to take him at face value. He makes the argument, based on the data. Okay, humanity started to improve. Standards of living started to improve in the 19th century. 19th century was, the birth of capitalism. Then he talks about how the state destroyed economies across the world. He doesn't even necessarily name specific places, but you can all the examples. You could cite China under Mao, the Soviet Union, Argentina certainly he would cite. You could cite Zimbabwe. All the worst examples of the state coming in and clearly, screwing up a nation and a society. And so he brings it in full circle back to the people who are in this room by saying that today it is not, the overt, Marxists and socialists who are the ones, advocating for all the policies that are going to destroy us. The people who you have to worry about these days are the neoclassical economists who form the intellectual foundation of economic neoliberalism. And so that's the point when he actually starts talking directly about the people who are in the room and saying that they use this fictitious concept of market failure, which unfortunately, and this is kind of where I think his speech is a little weak, but again, it's a time thing. He didn't have the time. Maybe if you sat Milei down and you focused him and you said, why is market failure what's wrong with the theory of market failure? Let me give me 30 minutes just on that go. You probably could come up with a pretty good answer. But it kind of had to be a throwaway line in this concept. But the long and the short of it, neoclassical economists believe that a market failure occurs when the free market does not lead to the most socially optimal outcome. And Milei correctly, and so this is his Austrian roots coming through, his Austrian foundation, in economics. This is a very, very common argument amongst Austrians. It's how you can sniff them out most quickly from like a neoclassical economist. And so Milei argues that the market is the ultimate arbiter of any business or service or goods value to society. The market is made up of every member of society. And so, if you are involved in some kind of private enterprise that utilizes scarce resources and transforms those resources into some kind of product or service, the test as to whether or not that activity, that use of resources, is a net positive for society at large is your profitability. If people are willing to pay more than what it costs you to produce that good or service, then that means you have created value, because the end product is worth more to the consumer and to the market than the sum of its parts. If people are not willing to pay more or as much, if the value of the end product is less than that of the sum of its parts, your venture will be unprofitable, you will go out of business, and those resources will be freed up and eventually make their way towards more highly valued ends. That's an ironclad law. And so the only way for the market to fail in its cutthroat allocation of resources towards their most highly valued ends for society is if the state intervenes and distorts the market. And so Milei brings up, and he did not have enough time. I'm kind of like trying to translate and add some context for what he said for people who watched, who maybe maybe you're not real deep into this stuff, which is fine. I would think that's most people. Not everyone's read treatises on economics, and I've certainly heard these ideas expressed in easier to understand ways than Milei did here. But again, it was a time constraint thing, I think almost entirely. He had a lot to get through in 24 minutes. Any one of these ideas you could easily listen to someone explain over 60 minutes. And so Milei brought up the concept that is often cited by neoclassical economists of market failure, known as monopoly. We all know what a monopoly is. Monopolies is like Standard Oil or the electric company. We have laws against monopoly here in the United States, or antitrust laws that will stop companies from merging and concentrating in an industry, or if a company is perceived as being too monopolistic and having too much market share in their own industry, the company will be split up into a bunch of smaller companies that will then be forced to compete with one another. And so what Milei was getting at here is that you do not have monopolies in a truly free market economy. The only way for a monopoly to form and maintain its position in a market is through state protection. The only way that a company can truly monopolize any industry to the detriment of consumers is through state cooperation, through state suppression of competition. And that's exactly what the elites across the West are engaged in. That is the nature of business in the West. It is always a competition in lobbying for which company can gain the most influence in the government so that they may garner protection for themselves against competitors within their own industry. And that is the nature I think fundamentally, I think that's the core issue with our economic problems here in the West. That's the way our system works, is that you have collusion between large, entrenched, moneyed interests and the state to prop up one another. And so that leads to a lack of competition because competition is suppressed. They raise barriers to entry, for example. They stop new companies from forming and entering these spaces. And so consumers are forced to overpay for undervalued goods. And we get a bunch of crappy companies consuming natural resources that could be much better used in other applications, essentially stealing wealth from the rest of the nation implicitly. They're stealing opportunity cost, in other words, because were these protections for these monopolies not in place, competition would force these industries to produce ever more valuable products that are of greater interest to consumers and are of more value, because that, by creating more valuable products, that's how you get bigger profit margins. And then profit margins shrink as competition moves in to try and undercut your profits by producing the same good at a lower price. But something I did find a bit strange is that Milei ended his speech by speaking to the business people in the crowd and not calling them out for colluding with the state, but rather praising them and saying again, maybe this was part of a strategy. You win, you get more, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. He said to the business leaders, "You folks are benefactors of society. You create value for the rest of humanity. The state is only capable of consuming and destroying value," all of which is true. So all in all, I liked what he had to say. He was correct. He was making good points. Although who am I to say, hey, you're supposed to go to this place and you should be more aggressive. He's already the most subversive voice that they have there. And I bet he's going to get into some interesting conversations with these people there. Because it was the same thing when Trump went to Davos. Could he have been more combative with them directly? Yes, he could have. But he already, when he went there, really shook the place up and made him nervous. So Milei goes up there and calls all of the government people in attendance parasites, basically, and is saying that you are what's destroying the West. I mean, it's, he's blaming all of the government people in attendance. So maybe it was smart of him to just focus on blaming the government officials and not alienating both the government and the private enterprise people there. Because he didn't go into as much detail about monopoly and market suppression as I did. All he said was that he stopped it, because people know what he, you can know what he means by this without going into as much detail as I did. He said that all monopolies are created by the state. And so he was putting all the blame on the government officials who enable the monopoly and do the actual suppression of competition, when he knows that the businesses who are monopolistic, who are benefiting from the monopoly franchise granted to them by the state, that they're complicit in that whole process, and so just as guilty. But anyway, overall, very good. I want more Milei. I want more Mileis in the world. I hope that he inspires more leaders in other countries, Latin America and elsewhere. It would be great to have a Milei, in Europe now. It'd be great to have a Milei in North America. Wouldn't it be great? You know, if the most pro-freedom president on earth was the president of the United States. I know it's not going to happen, but at least we got Trump. You know, Trump's better than, he's better than nothing. I'll put it that way. Trump can be very frustrating. He can make you want to pull his hair out. He can, he can even be, a tyrant and want to grab your guns and say, we're going to take the guns first and give you due process later. But, he is the biggest enemy of our enemies. So I'm not, I don't think that, the enemy of my enemy is my friend is like are great words to live by. But I'd rather put my faith in an enemy of my enemy rather than my straight up enemy any day of the week. I can be a strong anti-communist if I'm rotting in a concentration camp and I see the Red Army pulling up. I'm going to feel a little relieved. I'm going to say, you know what? I don't like these Soviet guys. I hope I don't end up having to live under communism for the next 60 years. Or 45-ish years. But at least they're not the Nazis. At least they don't plan on killing me in the next 5 weeks. They might end up killing me at the end of the day. I might end up at a gulag instead of this concentration camp. But we'll worry about that then. The immediate threat, is for now we have a common enemy. That's how I feel about Trump. Milei, I look at Milei and I go, you know what? Absolutely. He's one of my guys. We can have differences in style, perhaps, or tact, or priorities, but at the end of the day, we have the same worldview. So with that said, I will see you folks back here in the next one.